me or Kara or members of Shabtai, how we get our speakers. How do you get all these interesting people to come speak? And of course, each one of us in the room knows that there's another story to each one of us. But I did want to share something which I thought was important because there's a lesson in this story. So we've known Floyd Abrams since 2001 when Yale celebrated its tercentennial. We were looking for a list of 300 of Yale's most prominent Jewish alumni or Yale alumni of Jewish descent to interview and talk about their Jewish identity, their Yale experiences. And of course, we got through 300. And then there was 301, Floyd Abrams. So we reached out to Floyd and asked him if he would do an interview, and he was kind enough to be interviewed for that.
I thought I was part of the 300.
So does everybody in the 300. There's actually 3,000 that we refer to as the 300. So we were fortunate enough to have Floyd be interviewed, and then subsequent to the event, of course, we said, Floyd, we'd like you to come up to campus, and Harold Koh was the dean of the law school at the time, and you were nice enough to come up to spend Shabbos with us, with your wife, and we had a wonderful talk, and I even remember what you spoke about. This has got to be 15 years. You spoke about Rwanda and the radio announcers who were identifying the locations in which the Hutus and the Tutsis were hiding and calling them out on the radio so that they could be murdered essentially by their enemies, and it's a big question of free speech. Fast forward, it's been probably 15 years since, and we haven't heard from you. Although I think we've probably reached out a little bit, and we try to stay in touch with alumni and people who've been part of our organization. But what happened was I went over to the law school, it must be a few months, to drop off Justice Hanan Meltzer, the Israeli Supreme Court Justice who was visiting with us and speaking at Yale for a few days at different symposiums and lectures that we had arranged. And I brought him in, I drove him myself to the law school and brought him inside to meet with Jack Wolkin and maybe some other members of the faculty and the dean. And I came outside, and my car was out there, and I figured I would go home and then come back and pick Justice Meltzer up. But lo and behold, Floyd was standing outside the law school. I can't say he looked lost, but he looked bewildered. And so I turned to my good friend, Floyd Abrams, who I recognize because you haven't changed since 2001. You look fantastic, by the way, thank you. And I said, Floyd, is everything okay? And he said, yeah, but I'm waiting for my Uber, and I got to get to the train station. And I said, it's interesting because Wall Street, for those of us who know Wall Street, some people are afraid to turn up Wall Street because there's a sign that says do not enter on College Street. And I said, there's probably a more likely chance that your Uber is going to be afraid to come up Wall Street, which means you're not getting on this train. And I said, you know what, Floyd, we've got a judge inside. He's having a meeting. Hop in the car. I'll take you to the train station. And so you were kind enough to get in the car.
And here I am.
So the end of the story was, when he got out, I, of course, said to Floyd, he said, Shmuley, this is great, thank you so much. And I said, not so fast. And he was trying to get out of the car. The car wouldn't unlock. And now he's really getting nervous that he's not getting on his train. And I said, Floyd, there are no free lunches, of course. And he says, what do you want, Shmuley? And I said, just one event in New York for us. And he said, okay, I'll do it. The moral of the story is, that I'm, of course, now driving for Uber around Yale. So if you see me in an Uber, you may come back to speak. I think the moral of the story is that you should never hesitate to do a small favor for someone, because sometimes these small little favors bring us to wonderful spaces like this. And so thank you for trusting my driving. Okay.
Thank you, Shmuley.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open this up with just maybe about half an hour of Q&A with Floyd, who I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time in person earlier this week. I think Floyd needs no introduction to most of you, but I wanted to first make everyone feel very comfortable in the event. Every time we host one of these events in our home, we do want everyone to speak freely, have a chance to speak their mind, and really to give every person who comes a chance to, we take it you're here because you have something to say on the issue and really want to give you a chance and really a space in which to share that idea with others freely, and please respect that as you leave the event in terms of keeping it confidential and allowing people to really have the chance to speak their mind in an open way. And I think a concern that my wife Apoorva and I, who those of you who haven't met her, is sitting right here, were harboring beforehand as we were talking to Floyd. We thought that it seemed even in the last half hour that a lot of us may have similar views on this issue in the importance of free speech at the university. And that's just a long way of saying that if you don't support the idea of free speech on college campuses, we're going to be certain to shame you and shout you out every time you share your perspectives. I just wanted to share that at the outset. No, I'm just kidding. I think that to the contrary, when we get to the the Q&A portion and when we ask you to speak up, one of the rules of thumb we always try to bring to the table in these discussions we have is if you feel like your view is more towards the anti-consensus, please prioritize that and sort of raise your hand higher and be more aggressive in trying to get into the conversation than just tilting in favor of whatever direction the current conversational direction happens to flow. So those of you who come before know that's how we like to roll, but for those of you who are new, we just wanted to share a bit of how we like to do these things. So with that, I thought I would really turn it over to you, Floyd, to first, not in the spirit of this being a legal discussion, because it's really not. I think our focus is on free speech in higher education, which is not at all, maybe you can in some certain technical ways go down the route of federal funding and this and that, but our goal here is not to have a legal discussion, but really to have a discussion about the ethos of what a university is supposed to be all about and how that relates to the spaces for free speech within a university. But that being said, at the very beginning, given your scholarship on the First Amendment, I thought it would be useful to anchor us at least in what you see, as you described in your recent book, as the soul of the First Amendment, in what it means in the historical tradition of this country, to anchor the discussion, and then we'll quickly pivot away from the legality and into the cultural questions of the university.
Sure, thank you. My book is more of a, for laymen and lawyers, I hoped, but more for laymen written, which focuses more on the differences between the level of First Amendment protection we have here and what occurs elsewhere in the democratic world. It made almost no comparison to totalitarian countries, except by quoting from their First Amendments, some of which are extravagantly written. I mean, if you read the North Korean Constitution, you will find a loving, to use a word of the president, a loving First Amendment written more broadly than ours. There's nothing about Congress not doing this or that. The public, the people shall have the right to this and that, and et cetera, et cetera. So most of that was really, I didn't mean it, there was no avoiding it, I guess, but I didn't mean it to be advocacy, at least in a direct way, of the American position, but I did mean it to contrast in a wide range of areas. We protect hate speech in a way that would be unthinkable in Canada. And I cited, and I will be teaching at Yale this fall, and the first case I'm giving my students is a rather recent Canadian Supreme Court case, which arose when a decision was made in Saskatchewan to teach about homosexuality. And a religious zealot, so characterized in at least one of the opinions, was so offended and really outraged by that he printed out on single pages and put in mailboxes. I mean, this could be in the 1950s. Mailboxes, a piece of paper blasting the school board and saying they're going to teach buggery, they're going to teach this, they're going to encourage that, et cetera, et cetera. That's a crime in Canada. And it's a crime because it is viewed as a hate speech against homosexuals. And he was found guilty, and the guilty finding was affirmed by the Canadian Supreme Court in a case which cited only one American case, and that a dissenting opinion from Justice Alito from a great First Amendment case here. And so most of them were sort of contrasting a case like that with a serious court dedicated to liberty that applies law as we know it, in the sense of being a law-bound and applied society, to our case involving the Westboro Baptist Church, which, as you may know, goes and sort of stands wherever the police will let them, as close to the churches in which American dead soldiers are being mourned, and have placards up denouncing the soldiers, saying this was God's choice of them and it was a good thing, and saying the reason for it is the softness, the weakness, the acceptance in the United States of gay rights, and that this is God's punishment for that. And the father of one of the deceased soldiers brought an action in court saying that this was what the law calls intentional infliction of emotional damage. And the Supreme Court, an opinion of the Chief Justice, wrote a rousing First Amendment opinion saying in so many words, speech like this gets special protection because it's about a public issue, gays in the military, the role of gays in American life, and the like. And basically he treated, I really don't, I mean, I much approve of the case, of the decision, but if he didn't minimize, there was almost no appreciation of the fact that while the speech may be First Amendment protected, and I'm glad it is, it's very painful. And it can have harmful societal effects. So that sort of case is what I talked about more than anything else. I talked about it in terms of libel, I talked about it in terms of incitement, and a pretty wide range of cases. I did not deal much at all with the sort of issue we have here, which is free speech on campuses, where just very briefly as a matter of law, we distinguish between public universities, which are treated as a legal matter as the government, and thus subject to all the First Amendment limitations, and private ones, which are not, but sometimes, indeed often, talk themselves into being bound by First Amendment limitations by saying that they choose to be bound, that this is a college which applies First Amendment norms. And so we wind up then with cases in which the subject is when the Republican club at such and such, and right now at least, it's usually people on the right asking, forgive me, a former associate of mine named Ann Coulter, to appear on campus, and people go crazy about it and protest and demand that it be withdrawn, which it isn't, and sometimes make it impossible, particularly for some of the more racist, I would say, and even when not racist, extreme right-wing speakers to appear on campus. And so we have a body of case law which has been developing relating to that sort of issue. More broadly than that, we have a situation in which, while I think this is somewhat diminished now, we have had the specter of prominent people being invited to speak at graduations or otherwise, and having their invitation rescinded because the student response was so offended by the notion, particularly in a graduation context, where being the speaker can properly, I think, be viewed as an honor, not just being invited by the Democratic club on campus or the Republicans, but by the university to speak, and to speak at that. And so we've had situations more than cases in which people have looked hard and passed judgment or not about behavior of students and usually lack of responses by university administrations. Two examples, and then we can move on. But one I think of, and I mentioned to you when we spoke. When I was an associate at my law firm, my roommate in a single, thank you, in an office that we shared, and I would discuss issues, public policy issues a lot. He later became the president of a well-known private, small, rural college.
In Maine.
Well, thanks. And he called one day to say the following had occurred the day before, basketball game. He mentioned that he had done a lot of recruiting to try to get minority students from the cities and the like. It was very difficult. It's very rural. And in any event, at the basketball game, some students from his college yelled racial taunts at players on the other team. And he said, "What do you think I should have done?" And he meant, in a way, what do I think the First Amendment norms were? That should apply in a situation which must be a recurrent one. And I said, I thought it was a very good response on my part. "What did you do?" And he said, "I called them into my office and I yelled at them. That's what I did. I told them it was inconsistent with being a student here in terms of behavior. And we didn't countenance behavior like that. That's what I did." He said, "You think I should have done more? Is it even, this is my language, is it even conceivable that by doing that, I violated First Amendment norms?" Because it was their speech. And it was speech which may well be protected under the First Amendment if the government had sought to punish it. I didn't answer it, so I won't tell you the answer, but I did, there is no answer. I thought he did a good job, is the answer, in handling it that way. More commonly, you have situations on campus generally in which right-wing speakers are either not permitted to speak or are shouted down, or one case I know very well, the mayor of Jerusalem spoke at San Francisco State and was literally shouted down, so he could not give a speech. A lawsuit was brought, it's been dismissed, at least at the moment, etc. Now again, that's public, so we're talking there as if the university were the government. And the argument there was that the government failed to protect the speech of the speaker. So that is sort of general background. Just to bring you up to date on, it's not a personal basis, but I am quoted in today's New York Times about the president's speech yesterday at CPAC, in which he said that he was going to sign an executive order which would deny funding for research or anything else from the federal government to colleges or universities which did not comport themselves in a manner consistent with the First Amendment. He didn't phrase it, you know what I mean. And my reaction, I mean, I've testified about some of the problems on campuses and the like. my reaction was that this was dangerous. That the idea of importing the federal government, notwithstanding that it's funding, but funding matters. The president said correctly, billions of dollars go to colleges and universities around the country. The idea of having a federal agency or entity, the Department of Education, who knows who, pass judgment on what is and what is not free speech and what is and what is not protected seemed to me something that I found alarming. And I found it, I said, especially so with this administration, which has been, at least on a verbal level, probably more hostile to First Amendment interests than any in our history. I mean, we've had administrations where journalists were jailed, and this has not happened with this administration. John Adams, the Sedition Act, 1798, Lincoln suspended writ of habeas corpus a few times in very trying times, but some copperhead journalists, as they were viewed, were jailed during the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt tried to get Pulitzer indicted. It got him indicted here in New York. Wanted him in jail because of what he'd written about the Panama Canal and the like. But what we've never had, in my view, is a president who, as a matter of continuous, designed articulation, talk the talk of suppression of speech in a way that this president has. Whether it's the enemy of the people sort of language, or we ought to look into the licenses of television stations, NBC, or I could give you a lot of other examples. So, in any event, my reaction, which is I didn't feel it was counterintuitive, but anyone that cared about what I thought about might have thought it was sort of odd, maybe interesting, maybe, that I was saying it was important for the government not to insist on First Amendment norms being followed at colleges and universities. Well, a long introduction.
Yeah, no, that's actually I think that was a very helpful introduction, Floyd. And I think that before we go to the Q&A portion, maybe just to continue to focus in on the topic at hand. So we'll take, for the purpose of this discussion, unless people feel strongly otherwise, take Donald Trump type issues, and we'll put those off the table for another day in terms of sociological, political commentary of the current political environment or administration. Maybe take that off the table. And then also, we'll just, albeit interesting perhaps for scholars and others we have in the room, the questions of the linkages between the federal governments and universities, be they state universities or federal funding for private universities, albeit interesting in certain ways. Let's just take that set of discussions off the table too. Right. And then just wear the hat of that, back to the story that you told of the university president. And by the way, how long ago was that story?
15 years.
15 years. So
and as I mentioned to you, I told that story at a meeting 2 or 3 years ago of professors and First Amendment scholars and the like, and 2 of the professors came up to me afterwards and whispered in my ear that today that university president would be fired if he did not dismiss the students.
Right. And so that's really where, for the purpose of now, I'd like to focus in is less on the legal issues relating to the First Amendment itself, but the question of whether university, if you're in the shoes, or maybe you have some in the audience, future university presidents who are in the shoes of making those kinds of decisions in running a university, what is it about the essence of a university that makes it such a natural place for them to at least claim to espouse First Amendment norms? And what does it even mean to adopt First Amendment norms in the context of a university where a president or an organization has no obligation to do so, but is doing so for a particular purpose related to its mission?
Well, let me respond on the sort of negative side first. hardly any of this has to happen. That is to say, the First Amendment does not compel universities, state or private, to have regimes where they invite non-scholars to speak. And some very serious, much more serious than I, First Amendment scholars, Robert Post for one, takes great umbrage at the idea of talking about First Amendment rights with respect to political speakers. His view is universities ought to invite scholars or people who can pass some test of educating the students to be the speakers. And that surely does not violate the First Amendment if they were to do that. The problems, the issues arise because universities, I think correctly, but nonetheless, because universities allow students to do inviting for their groups. So, you know, the Democratic and the Republican clubs invite someone, and then if you have a situation where, you know, the liberal scholars can come speak and the conservative ones have stones, in effect, thrown at them, you're back in First Amendment land, or even without regard to the law of it, you're back in an area in which any good university president would think, why are we allowing this? I mean, how did this happen that we wind up stifling speech when the whole theory, not just of the First Amendment, but of education, is to allow people to have access to, again, the widest range of views. Now, again, I repeat, because people don't, in my view, think about this enough. There is a case to be made, and certainly it would be lawful for a university to say the only people we invite to speak here, we including students, are people who we think can add to their education. So, you know, we're not going to have Pauls come on the campus, and we're not going to have entertainers, and we're not going to get bogged down in who's left and who's right. I mean, all that could be the policy. The policies at most universities is to be more open, either to define education more broadly, or to say not everything has to be educational in a non-pejorative, in an academic sense. And so that's sort of the starting point. I mean, almost all the cases and most of the situations that have developed, the things that have led to congressional hearings and the like, you know, have been controversial people who tend not to have academic pretensions even. Now, you get someone like Charles Murray, who was shouted down and physically threatened at Middlebury. You're talking about something else, a serious writer who one might invite to speak on a campus because he is of that level of quality. But a lot of the people in a lot of the situations that you read about are invited either as an action of provocation or just to, you know, send a message to the other team on the other side, we have our guys too. I mean, again, my own view, I think universities serve students, not disserve them, by being more open to people who have a different, often much less academically rooted body of knowledge or information to impart to students.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it in terms of the question of academic value versus lesser academic value, but then there's a separate question of, even irrespective of a different axis of whether or not they're going to be controversial or not controversial, I think your perspective is you could have your view on whether the academic value piece is an important value for the university to espouse or not, but on the realm of whether or not a speaker is controversial, that should not go into the calculus of whether or not they're given a chance to share their views on campus.
Right.
I think that's a fair statement of your view.
Now remember, speakers don't have a right to come to a university.
Of course not.
I mean, it's not a not universities are not, as a general proposition, simply open to the public to come to speak. These arise when students or the university invites people. And you have situations, Vice President Pence spoke at Notre Dame 2 years ago now, and a significant group of students walked out quietly, but walked out as he started to speak. That was criticized, in my view, unpersuasively, but nonetheless criticized by some serious outside viewers as showing what a closed mind so many students had that they wouldn't even listen to Pence. That's one way to view it. I viewed it as a legitimate, or I would not have thought of criticizing the students for walking out and making their, I don't want to diminish it by calling it political, making clear how they viewed him, and doing it in what I thought of as the precisely appropriate way to let they know what they thought. So these situations arise in a range of different contexts. And the one place that hardly anyone is arguing that this applies is in classrooms. I mean, there is no serious argument that there's some First Amendment right to have the other side from the professor there. There are situations. I was involved in one. I was the advisor to the faculty at Columbia when the university looked into charges by some students that professors were basically assigning books about the Middle East which were pervasively anti-Israeli, and B, mocking pro-Israeli students. The group that I served as an advisor to, correctly in my view, these are faculty, correctly in my view, took the position they were not going to get into what books were assigned or what the professors chose to teach, and that they would not pass judgment on whether what they were teaching was a fair way to look at the Middle East. They did make one finding about one young faculty member who had referred to an Israeli student who had served in the Israeli Defense Forces as effectively as what he had said was, "I don't call on war criminals." And that this body found was inappropriate. You'll be glad to hear that faculty member received tenure a few years later. The conversation, the public policy issues about this don't tend to be about what's taught and shouldn't be if we're talking law. And they don't tend to be and ought not to be about whether it would be better to assign this book rather than that book. There's another principle lurking here of academic freedom, which we haven't gotten into, but that would come to the fore if even if university administrations started requiring professors to assign one book rather than another for ideological reasons.
So let's continue to maybe get away from the legal side and more towards marching away towards the question of academic freedom. pause on one question that sometimes comes up as an argument where, let's just say you're in the shoes of a university president now, and there are the majority of students have an objection to, let's go back to the issue of a speaker being invited to campus for the sake of discussion, that they think should be disinvited or should not be permitted to speak. What would you say to the view that, well, aren't these the paying customers of the university? Are these not the students themselves, the units of demand that the university exists to serve? And I guess if you're a university president, why wouldn't you be accountable like any other institution or business? Maybe the argument would go to its customers who are ultimately paying for the thing that they get out of it.
The advice that I would give is that to view it that way is to attack the very notion of what education is and the role of a university. And I would also say, and this argument is always more persuasive than the first one, it will hurt the reputation of the university and of you if you go and do this, because I can promise you that you're bucking for a page 1 article in the New York Times and television coverage and cameras on campus, and you really don't want that. I've always thought it was sort of sad that you had to make that argument, but that's the way of the world.
Well, it's not clear that which direction that particular second argument would cut in the current environment anyway, in the sense that, do you invite the cameras by permitting the speaker or not permitting it? So if you call that a net neutral, the question of putting yourself back in the shoes of how much to take student interests into account when making a decision, in the sense that are they paying you to do what they want, or are they actually paying you for giving them something that they don't know ultimately what it is until they've come out of it? That's sort of to me, it strikes me as one of the key questions on the table.
I get it. I think the administration has to act, at least, as if they think they know what education is, but having said that, I quickly retreat to saying that, there was a time not so many years ago in which everything was reversed on this, in which the academic freedom issues and the free speech issues were mostly wealthy business people who sat on boards of colleges and universities and intruded into academic decisions as well as who's going to come and speak on campus. There's a movie from the 40s I recommend to you called The Male Animal, in which that occurs. A professor wants to read Vanzetti's speech as he was sentenced to death in Massachusetts in the Sacco Vanzetti case. The board threatened to fire him if he did. The movie ends happily. The good guys win. But when I was in college in the 50s, really the world was very different. I arrived at Cornell. They give you a card with your picture on it. It says you have to have this card with you at all times, and if you don't, you can be expelled. And the university decides everything, and so it did. I mean, that characterization of my generation as the cool generation, as opposed to all the one-word characterizations of later ones, was almost more complimentary than it was meant to be. But it is true. Speakers were not invited who were controversial. I mean, that is the way that issue was handled within living memory. They just weren't there. And even when the question arose, and I had knowledge of it because I had a professor who was involved in it. The question was whether to invite Senator McCarthy to come to campus during the height of the debate about McCarthyism. The decision was finally not to do it. I mean, a lot of people would have come. That they were going to propose, I remember they were going to propose a debate. They were going to do all sorts of things to assure it wasn't just him speaking. Columbia had that problem just 2 years ago when the Prime Minister or President of Iran was invited there by a student group. University didn't invite him. A student group, which otherwise invited all sorts of other people, invited him. There were great protests, nationally covered protests about him appearing, mostly because of anti-Semitic things that he routinely said as a matter of policy and otherwise. The president of the university took steps to assure that he would be the one questioning the visiting prime minister or president, Ahmadinejad. Yeah. One column writing about this later said that the Colombian president had found a new way to deal with controversial speakers, and that was by being rude to them. But he asked very, very hard, probing, hostile questions.
So, I mean, a final question before opening up to the rest of the group is maybe going away from outside speakers to universities, but within the university itself. There was referenced in the handout that some of you may have taken a look at beforehand, an example at least of the following phenomenon: the question of the role that professors at universities should enjoy in the form of historically codified in tenure, but you could think about that as embodying a broader concept of a protected class of actors within the university to preserve the values of academic freedom in expression, potentially coming under attack in recent years in particular, as a consequence of the same forces that we were just talking about as it related to external speakers, but here now within the university itself. What's your take on the importance of preserving institutions like tenure and really proactively safeguarding against academic freedom in the realm of the faculty of these universities?
I do think that tenure is a very valuable protection. It's a protection for sure against interference, sanctions being imposed. It has all the downside of the same thing, which is you can have people who never could teach and became worse, or who were never good scholars and now abandoned it, and worse. You know, but on balance, I think the protections afforded are more important than the obvious risks of doing so.
Great. We'll open up to the audience for questions or thoughts that you might have, and we'll start there and then go here.
My name is Mark Kaznovich. I went to Yale doing my PhD in genetics and thanks so much for this. So my question, I'm trying to articulate it, but you both said an important word, I thought, norm, that is very complicated because it seems like the law in this country and just the tradition of Western Christendom only covers a small part of your behavior. And then there's the rest, which is norms. Yeah. And they're not legislated. And it used to be it still is, you can't say certain things in public, not because it's illegal, but because reputational norm. Now with technology, I think they're trying to do this in China, there's a whole extra legal infrastructure. And you don't vote for that, but maybe the norm in the 50s was there's an American mission and you can support that, and it comes from people going to church and all these things. Now, norms have shifted. There are all sorts of things you can't say in a polite society, so to speak, because you might not get a job. I'm actually kind of careful about what tweets I like or retweet, because there's some reputational score that's in the background. What are your thoughts on the extra legal infrastructure that's starting to be built socially?
Look, a lot of things that used to be said in the privacy of a telephone are now routinely said online in one way or the other, often, at least often enough to say so, to the great harm of the speakers themselves. I think that the cliche of calling it the Wild West on the internet significantly understates both the darker side of the impact of it and the near impossibility of doing much about that. I mean, one can stay off it. One can not tweet, but it is a new world that we live in this respect. I mean, from a First Amendment policy perspective, it's a fantastic new development that the public in general, for almost no money at all, can have access to more views, participate more easily in ongoing discussions and the like, in a way that was absolutely impossible just a few years ago. But the other side of that is that some social norms, as you point out, dissolve in this new world. One has to teach children about avoiding saying things which can hurt them blank years later getting a job. I mean, there are now places for Nazis to talk. There are now places for potential terrorists to talk. That was much harder not that many years ago. And one of the prices that is paid for the new forms and nature of communication is that people who do some very bad things for the first time in our history are able to find other people who share their views and are prepared to go down those very dangerous and society-harming roads. I mean, this is not a forum, a discussion on this issue, but one of the issues that interests me the most is what we want from Facebook. I mean, to what extent do we want them to play a more of an editorial role? Do we want them not to carry certain views and positions and the like? And is it possible? You have 3 billion people who are participating to even begin in a meaningful way to do that.
Hi, I'm Jordana. I was a member of Shabtai when I was at the college and the law school, and I'm now a student advisor at Columbia Law School. So I completely agree with the last thing you said about the importance of tenure and preserving academic freedom within institutions. And I will be the first person to say that the level of, in my view, hyper oversensitivity on the part of students and the general population in terms of silencing people of various opinions at schools is hugely problematic and overblown. At the same time, I do observe and deal with the aftermath of it's particularly a problem for 1L professors that are just assigned. So you can't opt out if you've heard things and you don't like it, that will say just blatantly racist and sexist things in the classroom, either directed at students, kind of similar to the war criminal comment, but in this context, or just in general with the effect that students feel legitimately uncomfortable and like they can't participate in the classroom. And I guess, where do you think the line falls between protecting the rights of the professors and all of the good that can come from that, but then also making it a safe enough space that students feel able to speak and learn in the classroom?
There have always been some professors at law schools who take advantage of their position and believe that they're doing so in the service of education, and who make and have made in years gone by, probably much more in years gone by. Students feel uncomfortable. I don't have any answer about how to deal with it, especially with tenured professors. When I was at Yale Law School, there were 3 women out of a class of 155. They were called on for every rape case. They were made to feel more uncomfortable, and for no reason that you could possibly justify, than other students. I don't have an answer to the question. I mean, my answer would probably be, I don't want outsiders involved, telling Columbia law professors what to teach or how to teach. And so it's got to be determined within the law school itself. And yes, I do think that the law school would care, the administration of the law school, including faculty, would care and might try to do something informal in response. But that's as far as I can see.
Can I ask a question back? Jordan, so you hit on a word that frequently comes up in this dialogue of either the feeling of uncomfortableness or discomfort. Are there, in your mind, contexts in which the experience of that feeling, even in an intense way, is inherent to the educational experience and make for a better, tougher, more thoughtful, more aggressive in the world student on the back end of having experienced that?
I think that there's certainly a place for that. For instance, if the student holds a view and that's being challenged and that makes them uncomfortable, absolutely. If a student feels like they're not able to participate in the classroom and they can't be heard from and they might be attacked, or they're just feeling like they're being kind of publicly embarrassed and ridiculed by virtue of being a woman or being gay or anything else, I think that type of discomfort in the classroom, I don't see anything that's served by that.
And do you feel like, of course, in the full realm of companies, you have government institutions, you have universities, there's outliers, bad actors in all of those spaces. But do you think that there's something more about the university where you would tend to think that the experience of making someone feel uncomfortable in that way in a university or a professor's relationship with that person is different than my seat, for example, in running a company and an employee in a work setting outside of the university? I guess that would be my question for you.
I actually think that, maybe, and I can understand this might seem a different way, but I think even more so in a university than in a company, because a company, you're there to work, you can come and go, but I think a university is a place where people come to learn and participate, and if someone is being singled out for some inherent characteristic about them that I think is completely unrelated to what they're there to do on an intellectual level, if they're made to feel like they can't participate in this place for something like that, I feel like a school of all places is the most inappropriate and harmful place for that to happen, more so than at a company.
Interesting. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Could I just add to that I think there is an added factor with respect to the teaching of law, which is that the Socratic method, by its nature, is one in which questions, statements, assertions, student responses are treated with a level of brutality which simply does not occur in other areas, and it's on purpose, not for illicit reasons, but because it is viewed as a good teaching mechanism. I mean, I think there are ways to teach without doing what you are identifying to us, and to teach very well. But I'm just saying that it is, at least in many situations, inherent in the Socratic method that the questions will be very probing and deliberately painful, albeit the ones that you're talking about seem to me improper.
Right. See, I agree with you. And whether that's a good pedagogical thing is a totally separate question. And I'm less about that and more like, oh, Susie can't answer this question because it's that time of the month. Like something that has nothing to do with that. But yeah.
Ben and then Nick.
Sorry, I thought your question was comment was very interesting. What do you think the policy of the administration should be ex ante? Like what should be the governing principle to be applied such that one can distinguish between, in your view, good and bad discomfort?
I think that challenging people's, and I understand this is completely fuzzy, but challenging people's ideas about certain things is fine, and pressing them to defend those things. I think that making them feel uncomfortable in that way, I think that making someone feel uncomfortable or attacking someone for who they are, either by saying something disparaging to them directly or by saying something disparaging about a group of which they are a member, kind of categorically in front of them. And I'm talking groups that aren't based on thought. So it's not even anything political, and nothing affiliation in that thought-based affiliation in that way, but I think things like gender, race, sex, sexuality, I think that I don't know where beyond that it goes from inappropriate to appropriate, but I think that itself.
I was just like, where do you put the IDF war criminal comment? Because that person did not have to join the IDF, and I'm sure from the professor's perspective, they were just making like a policy comment about the government of Israel.
Is it better or worse than, is it that time of the month?
So calling him a war criminal, I think that is completely inappropriate. That is on the line. Saying, the professor voicing his views about what the Israeli army or military is doing in general, I think that's okay. I think that using that as a basis for like attacking a student in the class personally is completely inappropriate.
What if the student had
Would you give a couple, because it's a great line. There's a lot here on topic for this line of question. Joe.
So I think that just in general, there's a lot of ways, especially in our society and politics and discussion as we know it, the identity, your personal identity has become political. So saying my general views on the on violence, police brutality, is not just saying a political comment or a comment about what is the right, what is the good, what is just, but it could be perceived as being an attack on an individual. And how does one create a university where people are comfortable with discussing those views without feeling individually attacked, while still learning the strength of character to participate in those conversations and in those debates without resorting to a safe space argument?
And maybe because we're married and maybe think about these things similarly, but I would come at it from the opposite angle, to go apart from this discussion for a second, but we can bring it back in. in terms of the rationale for universities drawing from categories of people that are diverse, but diverse defined on the basis of the exact metrics that you identified, race, gender, etc. There's social justice goals that are some people offer, but put those to one side. Usually it's something internal to the norms of universities specific to that, enriching the intellectual perspective that one brings, and rests on the supposition that ideas and identities are, in the modern sense, inseparable. And so to go back in the other direction, just to push you for a second, I'd love to hear your response. Well, if that was the premise for creating the diverse identities that converged in that classroom, that the ideas and identities were inseparable, then does going after the idea and identity jointly as part of that intellectual pushing, Socratic pushing even, does that make you view it any differently?
I think that I perceive a line in my head between the identity attack and the broader discussion. So I think that a discussion like that about police brutality, I think that's perfectly appropriate. And I understand that there's all of those kind of underlying tensions and or microaggressive comments and whatnot as it would be described. And I think that the classroom is the perfect place to be having those conversations. And I think it's really, really, really important that such difficult conversations be had in the classroom, but I see something really different between having that conversation and even saying I think the police are right for XYZ reasons and this, why, that, and saying to someone in more or less words like you are bad because you are black. I think that there's, and I don't know, that's the answer to the question of where that line is crossed. Like I ask because I have no idea, and I think it's so hard. But I think that at some point you get to a point where
Very brief one.
free speech is no longer valuable and helpful.
I mean, it does seem to me that the IDF example, though, has to be an easy one. I mean, if we're not prepared to say that a professor ought not abuse a student, because that's what that is, and mistreat a student because he served in the armed forces in Israel, then we're not using language and common fashion.
What if he wasn't calling him a war criminal, but directing a more pointed question to him, calling him out in front of all the other students because of his identity as in the background that he had? Is that on the right side of the line? Back on the right?
I think so. You come here from a foreign country, or it doesn't have to be foreign, but you have a certain background. Suppose a career soldier, American soldier, is in class. I don't think there's anything wrong with, and I think there's a genuine educational value in probing, and sometimes probing uncomfortably, based on the student's background in that sense.
And calling, if it was a class of 100 people, to say, I know you came from the Israeli military. Shouldn't you have a view on this that's different?
Yeah, I mean, we would be uncomfortable if said you come from Appalachia, so we know about you people. There is a point, and that it is simply improper to make assumptions about individuals based on backgrounds.
And we can leave this topic, but do you think there's a link or not, or should there not be a link between the idea of drawing from categorical boundaries defined in the admissions process, which presume that these people from categories will bring ideas of a certain kind that we then have to suspend once we're in the classroom or in the university setting with those categories manifest?
Look, I think the norm has to be, it is appropriate to seek a wider range of students from different backgrounds and the like, and B, they shouldn't be treated differently once they're there based on those factors.
Nate.
Can I switch topics?
Please. Yep.
I wanted to go back to your comments about Robert Post's view of the appropriate role of the university vis-a-vis inviting people. And to make the case for an argument like that, it seems to me that when a student decides to invite an outside speaker primarily to advance that student's own political agenda, they're taking advantage of the university's resources to do so, not just in the sense of the classroom, but they're trying to use the prestige of the university, which is not really theirs to use, in order to advance their political agenda. So it seems to me that there's a colorable argument for a university saying, we're not going to let any students invite speakers where we believe the intention is primarily to advance a political agenda, because they're capitalizing on our sort of like intellectual capital to do so.
I think the problem with that is the importation into it of intent. I can see saying, we do not exist to talk about politics here. I mean, this is a course on Sartre's philosophy, and we choose, not just in the course, but more broadly, to limit the range of speakers almost by topic, but making the topic academically genuine and relevant. But you better make it clear to the students before they arise that they're in a political policy free zone.
Go ahead, John.
Thanks. So you started off by saying most of this, the people who are
Talk loud so people can hear you.
pushing the envelope of the debate these days tend to be coming from a right-leaning political perspective. I think that's true. Particularly bizarre example, though, recently of the left arguably suppressing speech took place at Yale during a conference, the Rebellious Lawyering Conference, where probably the most progressive district attorney in the United States, the Philadelphia district attorney, was invited to the conference and then uninvited based on a particular position he took in a particularly controversial case, uninvited by the left that was uncomfortable with his position in this case. So truly, I think we are crossing a bizarre threshold with some of this. But I wonder if actually there is a reason why it is the right that is pushing this debate, and what you think the relevance of this factor is, which is that I went to two American universities, where I didn't do a scientific survey, but probably 85% of the students were left-leaning, and 95% maybe of the faculty was left-leaning. So if you are a right-leaning student or a right-leaning faculty member who believes that the university is actually not presenting, and I say this not remotely as a conservative, but if you believe the university is not actually presenting a full and accurate representation of American life at an American university, isn't there an argument just along very similar lines to why we want diversity of all types at universities to actually be pushing forward more speakers from a perspective that is, dramatically underrepresented in these universities compared to the rest of American society? Or does that not matter?
Well, it seems to me the question is, the threshold question is what role do we want the university to play in this at all?
Right.
I think it is. I would factor it in with a less represented group, or with fewer students, as you rightly point out. If I were making the decision about what was allowed, unless the decision was anyone who's not engaged in some sort of overtly racist or whatever advocacy, to probably bend over a little bit more in the direction of allowing a more controversial and worse right-wing speaker. But look what we learned from my very difficulty in articulating a position. It's almost an argument for something close to an anything goes policy, if you once start with a policy of letting students choose the speakers. If it's something else, then the debate, I think, is something else. Again, when it's the university inviting a speaker. But look there even. What? I don't believe any cabinet member from this administration would be, warmly received at almost any university in America. Now, that's not a reason not to invite, but I'm sure the administration, to the extent they choose speakers, understand that's a
Not lost on them.
that's a reality. So when they choose a commencement speaker, and I say this sadly, and I don't know if what I'm saying is true, but I wouldn't be surprised if, in order to avoid the conflicts that we've seen on campuses, they just sort of stay away from a lot of speakers who could contribute significantly to the education broadly but seriously articulatable in making the invitation. It's almost too easy to avoid these problems if you're the one doing the inviting and you're the one, the administration, the university is going to pay the price not to invite. Now, I left out one factor here which I think you ought to consider, because I use the word price. These are very expensive endeavors. I mean, University of California spent $600,000 with respect to one speaker who is coming to assure security and this and that. And again, if it's a state school, the law may very well be, as a matter of First Amendment law, that you can't make the speaker or the students inviting the speaker pay, based on some Supreme Court cases in related areas. I was asked by an alumnus of a very Tony, small, non-main college, if they were in a position where they'd have to pay an enormous amount of money for security for a particular speaker who was a Murray-like speaker, someone who's written serious books taking very controversial positions. And the answer is, so far, is yes. And therefore, and I don't have any inside knowledge on this, therefore the on-the-ground result must be that those speakers are not being invited when the university is the one
To me, it's
doing
more
the
of an
inviting.
argument for carving out space for students to supplement.
Yes. Yeah, it is an argument in favor of allowing students to play a greater role.
So we have a couple of law professors who also may have unique vantage points on this.
I don't want to hear law professors.
But other people, I think, do. So we have about 20 minutes left, so we'll get around to a few more questions, but why don't we want to go to you, Jed?
Thank you. I don't think I have any unique perspective on this, but taking up Vivek's initial proposal about saying things a little bit counter to the usual direction, I think it is important to value universities that choose to take positions with respect to speech that are not First Amendment positions. They're anti-First Amendment. And I'm talking about private universities, of course. So this began when universities began to adopt hate speech codes. And they wouldn't be able to do it if they were public universities. It'd be unconstitutional. But private universities have the right, but it's not just they have the right. I think we should value it, because there's a really important reason why we separate state from private entities, especially with universities, because they've played a very special role historically in challenging orthodoxies and in challenging sometimes repressive governmental positions. So universities, in times when government is doing stuff that's very disagreeable, repressive, oppressive, universities have been the ones, private universities, to stand up and say, we're going to challenge that orthodoxy. And we have to be proud of that, and we have to value that, even if we disagree with, I wouldn't want to go to a university that, is anti-free speech, but, that's sort of where things are heading, and we have to value that tradition. I think it's important. That said, I think a lot of the remarks Floyd was making, a lot of the problems we're seeing around the country today on campus have to do with the following, that the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of expression cannot survive without a certain cultural support. It's not enough for the law to support it against the government, but it can't survive without a certain kind of, unless it lives in a certain kind of culture. And you can give very clear examples of this, like you mentioned McCarthy. So if you can't get a job, if you express certain views, that's not the state doing something to you, but no one's going to, if people live in a culture of fear, whether it's economic or ostracism or whatever it is, so they can't speak their minds, they can't say what they really think, and they even stop thinking it to some extent, or if they may keep thinking, I don't know, but they can't say it. You are no longer living in a society where the freedom of speech is we. That's what was wrong with McCarthyism, even though a lot of what was going on was private activity, private employers, Hollywood, blacklist. Didn't we learn that lesson? Those are private actors, but that was a huge threat to the freedom of speech. And I think we're heading toward that moment now in this society. I had a student, 2015 at Yale, who was a vet, and he came to me one day in the middle of the first semester at Yale. He says, you know, I served in Iraq, and this is going to sound boastful, I hope it doesn't, but I want to tell you, I've had bullets flying over my head, and I wasn't scared. I don't know why it was, but I just was never scared. You know, I should have been, but I wasn't. But at Yale, he was a conservative student by Yale standards. Of course, it doesn't take much to be a conservative student, but he was conservative by Yale standards. I'm sure he would have thought himself as a moderate liberal, you know, his whole life. But he was a fascist at Yale. But so he said to me, "I am afraid at Yale to express my real views about things. I'm afraid."
I must jump in.
If I could just keep on for 1 second. Sorry, I was really. But so you know, what do we do with that? Of course, you know, I said to him, "You got to stand up and say it anyway." But you know, he's testifying to a certain, you know, this is the reality, and it goes back to Jordan's question. Well, we have to. I'm okay with speech codes that like prohibit racist speech and homophobic speech, stuff like that, even if they would be unconstitutional if applied by the government. But when, and we have to respect a lot of student dissent, like the shrieking woman in the video of the third example, the Halloween video that everyone makes fun of at Yale's campus. She's shrieking and she's screaming at Christakis for, you know, whose wife it was who wrote this thing. She's actually exercising her First Amendment. Everyone's making fun of her. Oh, she shouldn't do that. She's speaking loudly. You know, you got to respect that. Nevertheless, that said, we are reaching a tipping point where the culture is such. I see this in academia. I have colleagues, professors, friends of mine, who say we can't say what we really think anymore. What we think is true, what we think is right, we can't say it. I've heard so many. This is not the American Academy I went into 30 years ago. It's a different place. It's terrible. It's a terrible development, I think, and it's a problem for a society that wants to believe in itself as one that values the freedom of expression and freedom of thought.
And whose job is it to play a role of leadership in driving that change, if not the university charters and administrations themselves? The cultural change, where does that come from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I don't know, but I think that you have to have a little sympathy. You know, the university administrations are even more terrified than the professors are. And the students that I was talking about, they're the ones who are really running scared. It is embarrassing and horrible to see. It is humiliating to see university presidents and deans back down and collapse and not support professors who, you know, say stuff. And you see it all over the country. But you have to understand, because they realize that the one constituency that can get them fired, actually lose their job, is, you know, an activated, motivated, ideological, social media campaign, often on the left, you know, with mainstream media too. And so, you know, you have to understand the realities of the world they live in. But yes, it's the administrations, like in Chicago, that need to do something about it. But I think.
Yeah. You go here and then.
So I think the problem around universities has always been really interesting to me, and I think we've valued diversity at universities so much about having diversity of gender, of race, and what would you think of there being a diversity of political opinion? What if that was just something you happened to list that universities could do with what they wanted, but what if you just listed that as one of the things that would contribute to diversity to university?
That's a microaggression.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In theory, it ought to count for a lot, because in theory, the whole inclusivity movement on racial and gender was supposed to be based on ideological viewpoint diversity. Of course, that was the problem. That was always not true. It was always a social justice movement disguising itself in the language and the ideals behind the language and ideals of.
I don't know. I bought it.
What's that?
I bought it, perhaps.
Yeah, but you should, because that was never what was happening. But I'm not against that social justice movement. I'm in favor of inclusivity and affirmative action for the social justice reason. I'm just not in favor of it on grounds. But taking the grounds of the diversity movement, the way they present themselves, what you're saying, of course should be done. Because it's crazy how underrepresented certain, but of course, do you want to give people points if they are a Nazi? That's like ideological diversity too. We have very few of those. I don't want to give points to those people. Like, let's definitely bring them on. Nobody's a Nazi. So I wouldn't do it. But then I don't. So I'm not in favor. But taking the view seriously that everyone believes in ideological diversity, of course it should be.
I just want to push back on one thing that you said about the girl in the YouTube video, because I have no problem with the fact that she was speaking. What is very problematic and definitely wasn't at all censored, which should have been, which was with the things that she said. You cannot swear the way she swore at a professor. You can rail, you can rally for what you believe in, but there has to be a point where that is unacceptable. And if that becomes acceptable, and I don't know, I'm sure most of you have seen that. I mean, I have children. Under no circumstances would I allow my child to have not had any repercussion. I would have pulled them out. They would have been grounded for a year. It's unacceptable to ever speak like that. I don't care what's going on. And that, I think, was celebrated, that on campus it was, I think off campus, which is kind of a sticky situation when you have a private university that relies heavily on the funding of its alumni who may, in fact, disagree with the on-campus politics. And so then it becomes tricky, right? Because yes, then the administrations really have an issue and they are running scared, or I don't know what they're doing. But I think in this situation, this was not at all addressed, which was, yes, you can be upset, you can rally around the professor, but to what point is this allowed? And do we come as the president of the university where we say, okay, at this point where this is unacceptable, and therefore we need to call her in for the language she used towards the professor? I mean, I don't know if that's something that can even be addressed.
I don't have any view.
There's a very famous
No,
common law case, the Cohen case, of course. The guy has a jacket that says "fuck the draft," and California wants to throw him in prison because it was offensive speech,
Right.
not because he was criticizing the draft. And the Supreme Court says he gets to use the word. But this goes back to if a university wants to have a civility code, like a hate speech code, I'm not sure a public university could do it, but a private university like Yale, if they wanted to, I think they could. And
Yeah, so do I.
We should value that if they do, and then I might be in favor of it, and then we could do it.
Good luck with the social media campaign.
I want to echo what you said, Jay, because I think this is really what the debate, what the discussion is about. You talk about the soul of the First Amendment. Just the notion that you use that word. We're looking for the soul, the essence of what this is. And in light of what you said and what you said about the Christakis debate, as of last week, I don't know who's on the wall here at the law school, but we had a student Friday night who came for dinner who's a Catholic girl who's the president of FedSoc, Kathy Levis. I actually asked her to come today, but she couldn't make it. She's the president of the Federalist Society at Yale, and she came with her husband for dinner at our Shabbat table on campus. And at the end of the dinner, we got into a conversation. I didn't know about it. She had tears in her eyes, and she was literally emotionally charged. That there was a terrible discussion on the wall at the law school, which is an email list that everyone in the law school shares, where they went after her terribly to the point where a woman should have to cry about a speaker that FedSoc had hosted at the law school, and to the extent where there were even students suggesting that the admissions policies of the law school should change to not allow students into the Yale Law School that would theoretically bring this type of dissenting view to the campus.
That's the Yale Law School.
Yeah, and that's the Yale Law School, right. And
Yes.
so I said, you've got to come down tonight and really engage, and she couldn't. But I wanted to say something about, because I've read your book very detailed, and I've been hearing what you're saying, and I just want to say that I think what this discussion must lead us back to as Americans, as students, as parents of students, as educators, as people who care, is what you talk about, something going outside of the First Amendment. It's my grandfather was a rabbi, and he said to me when I studied to be a rabbi that there are 4 books of Jewish law that you have to study to be a rabbi, and then you become a rabbi when you're tested on those 4 books. But he says the most important book that you need to study after you study those 4 books is one that you're not going to be tested on until you become a rabbi, and it's called Common Sense. And I think to some extent, we've lost it. And it's so terrible that we can't just talk about common sense. You want to disagree with me? You can disagree with me. there's a way to have that discussion. And there's a soul of who we are as humans, as Americans, as people of diverse backgrounds. And we got so caught up with everything when it comes to, whether it's the politics of it or the legal aspects of it, we forgot the human soul of who we are as people. To be able to live together, to love each other, to learn to disagree, and to get together and have conversations that I think ultimately, deep down inside, we all actually want to have, regardless of where we are. And I think we have to go back to that. I think there's something that Toby talks about, which is chutzpah. You don't speak to a professor like
There
that.
are carrots,
And any mother or father should grab their kid who talks disgustingly to a professor and grab him out and say, don't talk that way. You disagree, and we have our children. That's the way we discipline our kids.
Who celebrates that? Who
Yeah.
celebrates that kind of
And at the
language?
same time, a woman at the law school who runs FedSoc shouldn't have to be crying at the end of the week because, based on a discussion that went up. There's another way to have that discussion. The notion that because FedSoc brought a speaker, they would go so far. I haven't seen the debate, I haven't the discussion, but I feel like writing an article about the wall. We're talking so much about walls. Maybe there's a problem with the wall at the law school. Of all the walls that we're worried about in this world, the wall in Palestine and the wall on the southern border, this wall is supposed to be a wall that unites and a wall that brings everybody together, and this is what's happening. So I think common sense and going back to morality and values and soul and spirit and the essence of who we are as people is very, very, very important. And in fact, I think it's the only thing that's going to do it.
Let's get a question there and then behind you.
Sure. I graduated from law school in 2003. The wall was my first experience of social media. And then it was physically a wall. But I had always thought that presaged everything I thought about social media. Most of it bad. But I would say that freedom of speech as a norm depends a lot upon freedom of association. Right? So the large purpose of the Federalist Society at Yale is that people who are on the right have other people on the right to talk to and share ideas with, and then have the courage to speak out because they don't feel that they're completely alone. Anyone in an intellectual minority depends, I believe, on a certain association to give them that kind of courage if they lack it. But I was wondering, especially from anyone on campus, professors or otherwise, my perception is that the universities are exerting more and more control, at least in the last 20 years, over student organizations. At Harvard, the final club now has to be both sexes. If it isn't, we won't allow professors to recommend students for Rhodes scholarships. Right? Other sorts of controls placed upon it, more subtle things in the last 20 years in the Yale political union. It's my perception. A, I'm wondering if those on campus who actually have experience with this, but they don't anymore, think that's true. B, is there more we can do to protect freedom of association, which would seem to be a way to separate the university from it, and yet still allow it to happen?
And I saw you nodding. Was your question related to that or was it different?
So I recently graduated 2018, and my question was tangentially related to that, but I wanted to ask what your perspective was on the relationship between the personal and emotional in connection with the textual. And I asked that because I was very involved in the Yale political union, and the debates oftentimes led into I as XYZ type of individual and list whether it be gender, sexuality, cultural heritage, the list goes on and on. That was a precondition that then led into discussions. And that then automatically chopped off the whole room of opportunity for true discussion and debate. Some of the things that I recall most from my undergrad experience were those seminars and those professor dynamics where I was challenged to take one, the opposing perspective that I actually had, but two, where my professors would really push back on what I thought personally. And I think going back to this matrix that you were outlining before of inviting speakers who are educational and academic, those who aren't necessarily, those who are welcome, those who are unwelcome. I'm very much on the side of if they're academic and contribute to our education, whether they are welcome or unwelcome, I think they have a place because where I grew most personally were through those experiences where I learned, yes, what I believe in on the one hand, but also what I respect from my peers And I was able to garner the ability to truly listen to these opposing perspectives.
Yep.
Just have a comment. I went to university in the 70s, and it may be my personal impression, but freedom of speech is a legal construct, and it exists by itself. You know, can someone say something or can someone not say something? But the willingness to listen and the willingness to hear is a societal construct. And what I personally found is we have less and less interest to hear what other people have to say, whether it be because we all can have conduits through the internet to hear only what we'd like to hear or like to read, or a societal construct which basically says that I'm insulted by your opinion. And we have to say more and more, don't take this personally, but my view is this, and then of course the person takes it personally and says, how could you possibly think that way? So I think if we're gonna make progress in solving this, we have to focus more on society's values in terms of what you'd like to hear. And I've read somewhere, I forget where instead of liking things, a way of judging how good or how persuasive an article is did it change my mind? And I personally seek out things which change my mind because I don't want to be mistaken. And I can remember, just as a personal example, I happen to be a physician, and when I went to medical school starting in 1978, our class was 25% women, and it was up from 10% women, just 10 years previously. So medicine went from 10% women to 50% women in a period of about 20 or 25 years. And it was a legitimate form of discussion and conversation as to whether or not women, can be surgeons. Are they good? Can they, deal with the stress? Can they? Now, if I said, well, my opinion happens to be that women should be surgeons, I'd be hounded out of the room, and perhaps appropriately so. But, society has an evolution of what is acceptable, but what seems to be going the wrong way is, what the cutoff point as to what is acceptable. So people get insulted, people feel that you're out of order, people feel that it's not an appropriate conversation, when it really is an appropriate conversation. And society, makes that cutoff, society has made that cutoff closer and closer to what the will of the majority is. And universities, hey, we're all leftists, so hey, the rightists don't get a chance to say anything. And I think that's a problem. But, the bottom line is I'm rambling a little bit, but I think if this is to be solved, there needs to be a more open-mindedness to other perspectives, because we can't solve this from a legal perspective. We must solve it from a societal perspective, in that people should be more open and genuinely interested to readjust their perspectives based on eloquency, or an eloquent argument, rather than saying, I just don't want to hear you. And I see society as moving that way.
The thing that sort of fascinated me about this last strand of discussion, I think we'll just close up in about 5 minutes, so we'll open it up for final couple of comments on this last topic, is I think the strand that you began, which is I think it's a fundamentally cultural question at issue that has perhaps even little to do with free speech, left, right, universities or not, but a question of living in a world where two seemingly different issues. One is how you speak in a civilized way, and the other is being receptive to hearing views that are different from your own and embracing them and being tested. Both potentially maybe rooted in a vacuum of cultural leadership, be it leadership that could come from the family. I love the way you phrased your question about which parent would have raised their kids or allowed their kids to speak that way, to the role of leadership of universities, which I think is what makes this discussion particularly poignant, in that we've at least fashioned the universities to play a role of actually leading the way people think, and the fact that that itself becomes the institution that is under attack culturally makes that particularly poignant. I think the question amongst a group of, I think part of why you pull young people out of Yale together, Shmuley, is to think about future leaders in different ways. Where is that vacuum in leadership going to be filled? Be it the family, be it university leaders, or be it some other source of people who ultimately make their contribution to creating a society of listeners, of people who are willing to create the cultural conditions in which free speech can actually take place. And I think that is a much tougher question to grapple with than just the question of who's right or who's wrong on a given issue, but leading the way to a cultural fabric that makes the rest of what we're discussing mundane by comparison. And if people have thought, maybe I'll turn it over to you, Floyd, on that.
Just the question I'm asking could lead to another half hour, and I know we're closing the curtain soon, but I just have to wonder out loud, would it help if the president of the university, when he greets the new students, or the dean of the law school, gave a speech which reflected some of these concerns that we're talking about today, and which made at least a moral demand on students for a level of tolerance, let alone trying to listen to people who have dissenting or different views? And if so, why does that never seem to happen?
I think it does need to happen, but more and more maybe because I believe it does start in the home, personally. I mean, I'm one of 12 and I have 7 children, and it is an incredible effort to play the line of where you advocate for your child on one end towards the institution of the education, and where you advocate for the institution also. And it's a very thin line that I play a lot. And I think that if it has to start at the university, that's really sad.
Yeah,
That an 18-year-old has to come in and say, I need to understand how to speak to someone, how to listen. I mean, it starts in the house. It just starts at home. I mean, for those of you who are planning to have children, God willing, one day, or who do have children, I'm sure that you can understand what I'm saying. It begins in the home, and that is something that maybe as a reminder when you get to college, now that you're in a more open space, you're not in your high school, you're not at home, you're in a place for a diversity of ideas, I'm going to remind you of something you hopefully already know.
So Nate, and then we'll give you the last word.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I ran for office this past year, and it was interesting, the experience, because I came in being like, oh, this will be a test of ideas, and we'll debate subjects, which was like the most preposterous idea. I mean, that was just laughably stupid in retrospect, because it was a contest for power, and my opponents did everything they could to, try to silence me by blackballing me with this or that, or attack my website, or like whatever they could do, whatever. And I was, did the same to them, of course, because that's politics. So it strikes me as I listen to this conversation, one thing that's important about universities in fostering this culture is that universities, at least theoretically, are committed to an idea of truth and debate and ideas. And it's actually one of the few realms in our society where there is an ideal there, and we should try to inculcate that. And so, the family would be nice if every parent believed that, but they don't have an institutional mission. We're certainly not going to get it in politics because everyone's fighting for power there. So it does leave universities and educational institutions as a place where, at least the values are in line with this goal, and therefore it's going to be a critical place for these conversations to happen.
Give you the final word.
This is a really critical situation because I am a Hollywood movie and TV producer. And I live out in LA, but I was born in...
And a lot of movies you've heard of, too. Yeah.
And I teach also at the Fierstein Graduate School of Cinema. They fly me in once a week. I teach a symposium on producing, writing, and directing. And if this situation isn't fixed at the university and academic level, which is supposed to prepare you for the greater society, here's my experience in Hollywood. If I told anybody that I admired Trump in Hollywood, I would not be able to get a job or arrested. And that is, the fascism of the left is equal to the fascism of the right. And so if that isn't fixed at the university and academic level, it's going to be a really big crisis for this culture.
And I think a closing thought for everyone, thank you, and the perspectives from households to universities to companies to filmmakers, I actually think raises a slightly separate spectrum. Maybe we can close on a reflection for everyone on the actual cultural contributions. And to listen to the two of you think about it, the answer may not be one or the other, but a more plural contribution to families and educational institutions, and where appropriate religious institutions, and informal associations like the people in this room, in inculcating the kinds of values that would create for a better university that only comes to exist when students show up at the age of 18. And most importantly, for the sake of the evening, wanted to really ask all of you to join me and give a round of applause to Floyd Abrams for making this happen. So.